Alright. Hey everybody. Mind Circus here with you. And just gonna go over something. Was talking to Twisted last night about the background stuff, and specifically, if you haven't watched them yet, we're talking about Big Brush 1 and Big Brush 2. This would be Big Brush 3 Revolutions, and it is the final in the trilogy of the Big Brush. Unless, of course, I decide to resurrect it later with a reboot. Alright, so what specifically we're talking about, let me just pull this up. Here's an ab I did a few nights ago for Magica. What we're really talking about is the background here, this kind of bit where it's flowing in and out. Another good example is one I did for Marie, and it's right here with these blocks. So these kind of cobblestones that I used, which I thought were quite Greek. So, really the question gets back again to fading these things and ways to do it. So in Big Brush 1, I went over using a giant eraser brush. In Big Brush 2, I talked about a couple of other things, including not just using the giant eraser brush, but the giant darken brush. What I'm going to talk about here is kind of pulling this whole thing together. So really it's going to be a lot of theory. You can probably follow along in just about any paint program. What I have here is an avatar of a cat. He's fancy. And what we're going to do here is we're going to grab the texture that Twisted was talking about. Let's start by just saying I find this particular texture to be situational. It's alright. It's not the kind of thing that I would typically start with. I would probably start with something a little darker around the edges, but that's not to say that we can't do something serviceable with this. So we'll just grab this, we'll hit copy, and we'll paste it right above our background layer. And just kind of center this. Now, one thing to keep in mind before we take another step is I'm not going to crop until I'm happy with that background. If I do that, and then if I crop and then I start playing with the background, I'm going to be pushing my brush around edges and stuff like that I really don't want to do, particularly if I'm using a really huge brush. So let's keep in mind the first thing is that I'm absolutely on my canvas at this point with plenty of room to move. The second thing to keep in mind is that I'm actually going to recolor this background before we do anything else. And to recolor it, I'm just going to pretty much grab a color that's in the image and color it to that. Now, since my main image here is black and white, then all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my texture and I'm going to make it black and white by just going to our colorize function and reducing our saturation to 0. Which gives me a decent version of black and white here. Then I'll probably do the same to the cat, because he's kind of an off black and white, so to speak. So we'll colorize that just to make sure that these kind of match a little bit better. And you'll also notice I also have a white box around the image there, just to set it across to say, hello, this is an avatar. Alright. So, go to our background layer. The first thing I'm going to do with this particular one, and usually with most of them, is I'm going to hit them with a sharpen. I'm going to hit them with a sharpen because I'm going to be fading them and they're going to lose their detail. So the more sharpen I can bring out before I start doing that, the better idea I'll have about what I'm doing. So I'm just going to hit it with a sharpen more. And this particular one, I'm going to hit with a sharpen more again because you're going to see what it does to it. It really kind of gives us this kind of sketchy effect that I really like. So, kind of got that there now. And then the next thing, we'll start on our big brushes, and I'm going to just start with my giant eraser brush. And I have it set to that smoke puff brush. Everybody's probably pretty much got something similar. So I've got that set to the smoke puff brush. I'm going to, of course, set this for huge, probably about 650 pixels at this point. And then, as before, just going to take out my edges and kind of bring it down towards the image itself. Now, the thing about brushes is they're supposed to act randomly. You're going to get little bits in there that you don't like. That's why I'm not going really tight in on the picture yet. So there we have it. This is kind of where I'm going to start to play with it a little bit more. So at this point, I'm going to go set it for the default one. And I guess the point that I'm making here is that this is a multi-step process. And really there's a really big difference, and I was talking to Twisted about this last night. There's a really big difference between making something look random and making it look unnatural. Nature is random, but it's natural, and it's kind of it's when we're doing something like this, we want to try to make it look random and natural at the same point. Now, if we're thinking about it, and we're actually going in there and thinking about where we're putting things, we're not going to make it random because we're planning all this stuff out. So really what I'm just going to do is I'm going to be going around it with a variety of different edges. Okay, and I'm going to go around it with a variety of different edges at a variety of different opacities, etc., just to slowly get it where I want it to be. So if you see there, I'm just tightening in those little spots, and that kind of works there, and I think I'm getting a little closer to what I want there. Now the next thing that I want to do is let's bring the opacity down. And that's looking okay. I'm actually going to bring this out a little bit, just so I have lots to play with. Okay. So then I'm going to go for my darken brush. Now sometimes I'm going to start with my darken brushes and then go to my eraser brushes. The reality is they're both kind of doing the same thing. The bonus of the darken brush is that it's going to get some more natural shadows and highlights out of it, but it takes a lot longer to do it effectively. So I'm using a mix of those, and there really isn't a rhyme and reason for it. But as I use more of these tools, and you'll see as I go on, I'm going to slowly start getting what I'm looking for. So with the darken brush, I'm going to set the opacity to about 23% here. And again, it's going to be a fairly large darken brush. I'm going to set this for about 600 pixels, 520. And I'm going to start darkening this, and probably have to up that opacity to get this done in a decent amount of time. Okay, so there you see, as we start working that brush, it starts pulling the more natural highlights out of it, and we don't get left with those kind of flat edges that really are the hardest thing to avoid when we're trying to do this, is those kind of flat edges. There's a big flat edge over on the side, and we'll take care of that in a minute. So there we have the beginnings of something a lot better. I'm going to go in here and just vary it while I'm doing it. And let's just try and do something more interesting with this edge. So I'm just going to bring the opacity of this up and bring it through like this. And when we come back into this, this is going to look a whole lot better. Okay? So we're starting to get where we want to be with that. And then I'm going to go back to my eraser brush, right? But with my eraser brush this time, I'm going to lower the opacity to about 12%, 15%. And I'm going to use a medium brush, okay? So I'm going to bring my brush down to about 170. And I'm going to create highlights and lowlights like this. I'm going to just alternate little clicks. Now, one of the things to keep in mind to doing this effectively is that I'm always just doing one brush stroke at a time and moving on. So it's just like click, 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 and then move to the next spot. And I'm just randomly, with the opacity low, kind of thinning it out in little spots. And if I start doing that, then what I'm going to get is just a more natural effect, as if light is hitting it at different points. So again, I can do that with the darken brush too, and I'll go ahead and just bring it down to about 170. So it's a medium sized. And then lower my opacity on this, and I'll start creating highlights and lowlights with the darken and lighten brush. And again, I'm just doing it once in a spot and then going on to the next one and then alternating my tools back and forth. But I'm not doing it, at any point to say, well, what's my next step? I'm just randomly clicking in spots. And it's because if I think about it, it's going to be unnatural. But if all I do is just put a click here and there, then I know what I'm doing. And it has the added bonus that if I don't like something that comes out of what I'm doing, I can just hit that Control Z right away. And I'm not going too far back. Okay? So there we go. It's a tough one. A lot of it is just, sensing when your eye feels good about it. A lot of it is just zoning out, listening to some music and clicking a few hundred times until you're just happy with the result. But as you can see, when you get there eventually, and I'm just going to take off this bottom edge a little bit, what we get here is something pretty cool. So even with a texture that I really, in the first place, wasn't that thrilled with, what I came out with was kind of a nice little effect. I'm going to hit this with one last sharpen filter just to bring out those highlights a little bit. And there you have it. Big Brush 3, the final chapter. Have a good one.